The Otterhound stood ankle-deep in the marsh, his long wiry fur hanging in heavy wet strands, though the water around him was strangely still. He had waded into this place since he was young, following his nose through the reeds, tracking the scent of fish and frogs, listening for the soft plops and splashes that marked the marsh's hidden life. Normally, the slightest movement disturbed the surface, ripples from bugs skimming the water, the swirl of a fish shifting below, the brush of reeds stirred by wind. But today, the water didn't move, not even when he stepped in it. The Otterhound lifted his paw slowly and set it down again. He expected to see the familiar spreading rings, the gentle tremor of disturbance. Instead, his paw sank into the murky water without creating so much as a single wave. The liquid closed around his foot like a thick, heavy gel, swallowing motion but refusing to react. He stared, ears twitching. He lifted his paw again, faster this time, and slapped it down. Still nothing. No splash, no ripple, no movement. Just a soft, muffled sound travelling through the water without disturbing its surface. He backed up slightly, eyes narrowed. His fur bristled despite the damp. The marsh had always been unpredictable, some days loud with frogs, other days silent except for gnats. But this was different. The water behaved wrong. He sniffed the surface. The smell was normal. Sulphur, algae, mud, the musky scent of small creatures beneath. But the behaviour wasn't normal. He leaned low and blew across the surface. Air brushed across water, but the marsh didn't tremble. Usually even the faintest breeze created ripples, tiny wavering lines spreading outward. Today the water stayed perfectly flat, reflecting a warped picture of reeds and dark clouds overhead. The Otterhound circled carefully, testing the marsh with each step. He sloshed through deeper water, but still saw no splashes. He nudged a floating leaf with his nose. The leaf moved, but the water beneath remained undisturbed, as though the leaf hovered on a perfectly invisible surface. He pawed at a clump of reeds. The stems bent, dipped, and rose again, but the water stayed smooth. A dragonfly skimmed across the surface near him, darting side to side. Its wings beat the air with rapid clicks, but the water below didn't react. Usually such a landing created tiny expanding rings. Today there was nothing. The Otterhound looked up as a pair of ducks descended toward the marsh, wings flapping heavily. They landed with a soft thud, yet not a single ripple formed around them. The ducks sank slightly into the still water, looking around in confusion. One dipped its head as if feeding, but even its movement didn't disturb the surface. The Otterhound tilted his head. Animals didn't understand unnatural changes, but they felt them. A frog leapt from a log into the marsh. Its body slipped below the surface, but the entry made no ripple, no splash, just stillness, swallowing stillness. The marsh's quiet felt wrong, not peaceful, suppressed. He moved closer to the deeper channel where fish normally gathered. He approached slowly, cautious. His paws slipped into deeper mud, and the heavy smell of silt rose around him. He peered into the murky water. Fish darted below him. Their movements stirred sediment, swirling clouds of darker mud, but again the surface remained motionless. The disturbance failed to reach the top, trapped beneath a layer that behaved more like unbroken glass than liquid. He leaned down, trying to sense the boundary. He brushed his whiskers across the surface. Nothing, no vibration, no tremor. He dipped his muzzle in. Below the surface, the water moved normally, cool, flowing, alive, but the moment his snout broke back into the air, the surface sealed behind it without a ripple. He growled softly. The marsh wasn't dead, it was muted. A human voice carried faintly from the far bank. The Otterhound lifted his head sharply. Two researchers were setting up equipment on a raised wooden platform overlooking the marsh. They placed small sensors along the waterline, devices he'd seen before in previous seasons when people came to monitor water health. One knelt and ran his fingers across the surface. He pulled his hand back immediately, eyes widening. "It didn't move," he said, shaking his head. "No surface tension reaction, none at all." Another lowered a stick into the water and stirred it vigorously. Thick swirls formed underwater, twisting into spirals, but the surface above stayed perfectly flat. "This isn't right," she muttered. "Water can't behave like this. Even oil would ripple under this force." "Maybe contamination," the first replied. "But nothing floating disturbs the surface either. It's like the top few millimeters are locked." The Otterhound didn't understand their words, but he understood urgency in their tone. He could smell the tension, fear laced with confusion. He stepped deeper, water rising to his chest. The marsh swallowed sound oddly. Even the splash of his body entering produced only muffled vibrations below the surface. He spun once, looking for movement. Birds perched in silence. Reeds swayed, but water did not respond. A snake slid into the marsh, its body vanishing seamlessly into the depths. No ripple, no wake. Even the wind failed to disturb the surface. The Otterhound felt his instincts sharpen. In a marsh, ripples communicated everything: the path of predators, the presence of prey, the heartbeat of the ecosystem. Without ripples, the marsh became blind. He moved toward a fallen log and pressed his weight onto it. The log dipped under him, but the water didn't react. The motion looked unnatural, like the world's reflection had detached from reality. He howled once, a low, uncertain sound. Normally it echoed softly across the marsh. Today the sound travelled, but the environment didn't respond. No frogs croaked, no water lapped, no surface quivered. If ripples did not form tomorrow, or the next day, or through the coming season, predators wouldn't detect prey, prey wouldn't sense predators, insects wouldn't land properly, waterfowl would lose feeding cues, oxygen exchange at the surface would suffer, plants would struggle to release gases, and the marsh, a living mosaic of movement, would lose the language that guided every creature within it. The Otterhound stepped onto a patch of firm ground and gazed across the still expanse. No matter how much life churned within, the marsh's skin remained unmoved. Water that wouldn't ripple was water that couldn't communicate. And as he watched the silent, perfect surface stretching into the reeds, he understood that something deep in the marsh's nature had failed. The ripples wouldn't form. By the following morning, the marsh felt older in a way that had nothing to do with seasons. The Otterhound woke beneath a thicket of cattails, his fur still damp from the night's humidity, his whiskers twitching at every faint scent. Normally the first thing he would hear was the stuttering chorus of frogs greeting dawn, or the buzzing of flies rising from the muddy banks. But today's morning arrived hollow and muted. He stretched, shook himself, and padded toward the water's edge. Overnight dew clung to the reeds, but even when those droplets slid off the narrow leaves and fell, they didn't disturb the marsh's surface. Each drop simply disappeared into the water without creating a ring, a tremor, or even a small indentation. He stepped in. Again, nothing happened. The water accepted him silently, like a thick skin that parted just enough to let him through but refused to reveal the impact of his presence. He waded deeper, muscles tensing at the odd resistance. The marsh enveloped his legs with the coolness he expected, but visually it behaved like a static photograph. He lifted one leg and scraped it sideways through the surface. The water beneath swirled. He felt the small currents brushing against his fur. But the surface above simply flexed elastically and returned to a mirror-like stillness. No swirling patterns, no spreading rings, no texture breaking the reflection. A small brown frog sat on a broken stump nearby. The Otterhound watched as the frog inhaled and pushed off the stump, leaping in a smooth arc. It hit the water with a solid, distinct plop, one he could feel through the vibration, but the surface did not register the entry. The frog's body disappeared beneath like a stone through air. The Otterhound whined softly. Nothing reacted. He padded toward the frog's bubbles, his only guide. The bubbles rose and reached the top, but instead of popping, they pressed against the surface and burst silently without disturbing even a speck of water. It was as if the marsh had developed skin too sensitive to be touched. He turned. A ripple-free marsh was a dangerous place. On the far side, a heron stepped into the shallow water, long legs moving with careful precision. Herons relied on ripples. They read them like maps. Ripples told them where minnows hid, where snakes slithered, where something large disturbed the edges. But this heron paused often, confused. It lowered its beak, stabbing into the water, but no outward movement showed where it struck. The heron lifted its head, feathers bristling with unease. The Otterhound watched her search for cues that no longer existed. A muskrat swam along a channel, normally leaving a neat V-shaped wake behind it. Today its body cut through the surface without changing it at all. The water parted beneath but not above. Its wake existed only underwater, invisible to the world. The Otterhound moved deeper into the murky centre of the marsh, where plant life grew thickest. He sniffed the air. He smelled rot. He smelled algae bloom. He smelled the sharp metallic scent of disturbed mud. But the marsh did not reflect any of that activity on its surface. A low rumble reached his ears. He perked up and turned toward the human platform again. More researchers had arrived, 5 now. They lowered cylindrical probes into the water and spoke rapidly while checking digital screens. Surface tension is off the measurable scale, one said, voice strained. There's no wave formation even under forced agitation, another answered. A third knelt, holding a small metal tube. Look at this. Even when we blow across it, no ripples form. The energy isn't transferring to the surface layer, which means something is preventing deformation, the fourth murmured. It's not viscosity, it's not contamination, it's a physical barrier that exists only across the top few millimeters. The Otterhound didn't understand their words, but he understood their gestures. Hands tense, brows knitted, bodies hunched forward with the posture of animals sensing danger. The marsh was changing faster than they could measure it. He waded farther in. Beneath the water, fish swam normally, darting, scattering, turning, but their movements failed to translate upward. A large carp thrashed near the roots of a submerged log, sending clouds of silt upward. The Otterhound watched the silt rise and reach the surface, and then stop, trapped beneath the transparent barrier. Even sediment couldn't break through. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the still surface. Everywhere he looked, the marsh behaved like a sealed container. He lowered his head and exhaled strongly through his nose. His breath pushed a depression into the water, finally a visible reaction, but the depression bounced back immediately, erasing itself without ripples. The water did not ripple outward. It simply returned to its original smoothness in a single motion. The Otterhound tilted his head, confused. Water wasn't supposed to do that. Water didn't erase motion. It responded. He heard a faint splash, actual surface movement, and whipped his head around sharply. But the splash didn't come from the water. It came from the reeds. A raccoon, dripping from a recent swim, stepped out of the marsh and shook itself vigorously. Droplets scattered in arcs, but every droplet that hit the marsh vanished without disturbing it. The raccoon stared at its reflection, baffled. Behind him, the heron lifted off, wings spreading as it sought higher ground. But even as its wings flapped strongly, the marsh's surface beneath remained flat. The Otterhound walked toward a shallow pool he knew well, a place where tadpoles used to swarm every early summer. He crouched and stared into the water. The tadpoles were there, moving, wriggling, alive, yet the surface barely acknowledged them. They rose toward the top but never broke it. They pressed against the transparent layer like insects trapped beneath a window pane. Some spiraled downward again, confused by the invisible boundary. The Otterhound pressed his snout into the water, and the surface parted reluctantly, allowing him through. He drank. The water tasted the same, mud, algae, faint mineral tang, but when he lifted his head, droplets clung unnaturally to his fur, holding shape instead of falling freely. The marsh held everything too tightly. He stepped back, shaking his head. If the marsh refused to ripple tomorrow, or next week, or through the season, predators wouldn't hunt, prey wouldn't hide, insects wouldn't land, birds wouldn't fish, plants wouldn't release gases, oxygen exchange would plummet, fish would suffocate beneath a trapped layer, amphibians would lose access to surface air, and the marsh would become a silent, sealed world where life moved, but the water no longer communicated anything. He turned, paws heavy, fur weighed down by droplets that refused to fall. Behind him, the marsh lay still, too smooth, too quiet, too unresponsive. A body of water that wouldn't ripple was a body of water that wouldn't breathe. And as the Otterhound stood in its centre, watching the mirrored surface stretch endlessly without a tremor, he felt something ancient and instinctive shiver down his spine. The marsh had stopped answering back.